The last sound was the grinding of stone, a final greedy noise that ate the light and left only the deep velvet dark behind, a darkness so complete it felt like a weight pressed against her eyes. Mortar followed, the wet slap and scrape of the trowel, a busy, indifferent sound, the work of men who would eat their evening meal and think nothing of the wall they had just made into a tombstone, because this was their job, and she was no longer a person. She was a task completed. The air, already stale with the dust of forgotten histories and brittle bamboo scrolls, grew instantly colder, sealed away from the memory of the sun, and in the profound silence that descended, Lynn could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, a trapped bird fluttering against the cage of her ribs. She did not scream. The sound would only be swallowed by the stone, a useless expense of breath that she might need later, and so she stood perfectly still, letting the finality of it wash over her, a tide of cold that had nothing to do with the chill of the Northern Archive and everything to do with the absolute absence of hope. They had left her here to die. Days bled into one another, marked only by the subtle shifts in the cold and the growing, hollow ache in her belly. Her world was stone floors, towering shelves of silent knowledge, and the faint persistent scent of decay. In the first cycle of darkness, she explored her prison not with panic, but with a slow, deliberate curiosity, her hands tracing the unyielding walls, her bare feet mapping the geography of her cage. The archive was vast, larger than she had remembered from her brief, dutiful visits as a consort, a labyrinth of paper and wood and silence. She found the cistern in the far corner, a place where rainwater was meant to collect for the washing of scrolls, and by some small mercy of the gods, a slow, steady drip, drip, drip echoed in the stillness, a leak from the roof somewhere far above. She pressed her lips to the damp stone and drank the metallic, gritty water, each drop a tiny victory against the fate they had chosen for her. It was not enough, but it was something. She remembered the stories the old tutors told, of monks who could survive on nothing but dew and meditation, and while she had no skill for meditation, she had a stubbornness that ran deeper than bone. Her father, a simple provincial herbalist, had taught her that everything had a use if you only knew how to look, that the earth provided for those with the patience to learn its secrets. Here, in this tomb of paper, she wondered what secrets the dust held. She found a small storage room behind a crumbling partition, a place forgotten even by the archivists, and inside were clay jars of dried roots, bitter woody things left behind decades ago, meant for making ink or binding agent, not for eating. She gnawed on one, the taste like dirt and thyme, its fibrous texture a trial for her teeth, but it was substance, it was fuel. She would live on secrets and dust and bitter roots. She would live. That night, or what she guessed was night, she heard it. A sound from outside the wall, the soft crunch of a boot on gravel, a throat being cleared, the clink of a key against a belt buckle. It was the guard. They had left a guard to listen for her end, to report back to the shimmering sunlit world of the palace that the task was truly, finally complete. The sound was not a promise of rescue, it was a vigil for her death. His presence was a constant pressure, a reminder that her suffering was being measured and observed from the other side of the stone. She learned the rhythm of his watch, the two patrols that bracketed the deepest part of the night and the one that came with the false dawn, when the stone of the wall seemed to hold a different, grayer shade of black. She never made a sound for him to hear. She became a ghost in her own grave, her movements fluid and silent, her breathing shallow. She was a secret she kept from the world, and her life was an act of quiet rebellion, a refusal to perform the ending they had written for her. The guard was her audience, and her silence was her defiance. He was listening for death, and she would give him nothing but the patient, grinding sound of life. Weeks later. The cold had settled into a permanent state, a deep and penetrating chill that the thin silk of her court robes could do nothing to repel. She had unraveled the golden embroidery from her sleeves, thread by precious thread, using the stiff metallic strands to stitch together layers of discarded scroll wrappings, creating a crude but effective blanket. Her body had changed, the soft curves of a pampered consort replaced by the sharp practical angles of a survivor. Her hunger, a constant, familiar companion now, a dull ache she carried inside her like a stone. The bitter roots were nearly gone, and the drip from the cistern was slowing as the season turned toward the dry cold of deep winter. Time, she knew, was running out. It was this knowledge that drove her to search for another way, a weakness not in her own body, but in the body of her prison. She began to test the walls again, not with the flat of her palm, but with her ear pressed against the stone, listening. She listened for the whisper of a draft, the hollow sound that spoke of a gap, a flaw in the mason's work. She spent days at it, a slow, methodical circuit of her world, until she found it, a place near the floor behind a rotting bookshelf where the air felt subtly different, a cold that was alive, a cold that carried the scent of pine needles and snow. There was a space beyond the wall, a flaw, a mistake, a beginning. She found a shard of a broken water jug, its edge sharp enough to worry the old mortar, and she began to dig. It was not a grand act of destruction, but a patient, tireless scratching, a mouse gnawing at the foundations of a mountain. The sound was minuscule, a whisper of grit on stone, easily lost in the sighing of the wind that she could now faintly hear. She worked in the deepest parts of the night, timing her efforts with the guard's patrol, resting when he was near, her body coiled in the darkness, her heart a slow, steady drum. The repetition of the movement, the scrape and pull, became a kind of prayer. Each grain of mortar she dislodged was a word, each fleck of stone a testament. She was not praying to the gods, for they had abandoned her here. She was praying to the stone itself, to the integrity of the wall, begging it to yield. Her fingers bled, the skin tearing on the sharp pottery, but she felt no pain, only a singular, burning focus. The small pile of dust on the floor beside her grew day by day, a measure of her progress, the only calendar she had. She was tunneling her way back into the world, one grain of sand at a time. The guard outside, a man named Wei who had served the palace for 30 years, heard the faint scratching once or twice. He paused, listened, and dismissed it. Rats, he thought. The place was full of them. He pulled his cloak tighter and continued his rounds, his mind on the warmth of the brazier in the guardhouse and the rice wine waiting for him. The casualness of his dismissal was a cruelty far greater than the wall itself, the easy assumption that nothing inside could possibly be alive enough to make a sound of its own volition. He was wrong. That night, the air changed. A storm was coming, a great northern blizzard that the palace meteorologists had failed to predict, and the wind howled around the corners of the archive, a living thing full of rage. The sound covered her work completely, a gift from the angry sky. But it also brought a new sound, one that made her freeze, her shard of pottery held tight in her hand. Voices. They were outside, near her wall, shouting to be heard over the wind. She pressed her ear to the crack she had so painstakingly made, the cold of the stone a shock against her skin. 2 voices, one male, one female, both sharp with imperial authority. She knew them instantly. The Emperor. And Gia, the woman who now wore the phoenix crown that had once been hers. Lynn's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing. They had come back. They had come back to gloat, perhaps, or to ensure the seal on her tomb was holding against the storm. But their words were not about her. They were about something far more important. "It is the only place no one would ever think to look." The Emperor's voice was strained, thin against the gale. "They can tear the treasury apart. They can search my own chambers. They will not find it." "You are certain it is secure?" Gia's voice was honey, laced with steel. "The foundation stone is deep?" "The very stone upon which the northern pillar rests. They sealed the wall themselves. No one can get in." A bitter laugh snatched by the wind. "A dead woman will guard it well." "A dead woman will guard it well." The words echoed in the tiny space Lynn had carved for herself. Gia's casual cruelty was a spark landing in the dry tinder of her soul, but the Emperor's words were a revelation, the foundation stone. She crawled back from the wall, her mind racing, her gaze sweeping the floor of the archive. The foundation stones were massive, raised blocks upon which the great wooden pillars of the structure stood. There were 4 in the main chamber, each one a testament to the dynasty's strength and permanence. Which one? The northern pillar. She scrambled toward it, her makeshift blanket of scroll wrappings falling away. The stone was immense, a solid block of gray granite, its surface worn smooth by centuries. There could be no compartment here, no secret door. It was impossible. But her father had taught her that nothing was impossible, only that you had not yet found the key. She ran her broken fingernails over its surface, feeling for a seam, a line, a difference in the texture of the stone. Nothing. She felt a surge of despair, a cold more profound than the winter outside. Had she misheard? Was this another one of their games, a final ghostly torture? She refused to believe it. She remembered the scrolls she had read out of sheer boredom in her first weeks here, ancient architectural texts detailing the construction of the palace complex. She remembered a chapter on secret passages and hidden vaults, techniques used by the founding emperor to protect his treasures. They spoke of pressure plates, of counterweights, of keystones that were not what they seemed. She looked not at the foundation stone, but at the pillar that rested upon it, and then at the ceiling high above, where the great beams interlocked. The architect had written that true strength was not in solidity, but in balance. Everything rested upon something else. If you could disrupt the balance even slightly. Her eyes fell upon a smaller stone, a wedge-shaped block set into the floor a few feet from the main foundation. It looked like a simple repair, a patch in the flagstones. But it was different. The mortar around it was newer, darker. It was the key. She had no tools, no crowbar, no hammer. She had only her own failing strength and the weight of the shelves around her. She began to push at the nearest one, a towering structure of dark, heavy wood, groaning with the weight of 1,000 scrolls. It was an impossible task. The shelf was bolted to the floor, ancient and immovable. She pushed until her muscles screamed, until black spots danced in her vision. It did not budge. Defeated, she slumped against it, her body trembling with exhaustion and failure. And as she slid down, her hand brushed against the base of the shelf, feeling for purchase. Her fingers found not smooth wood, but the cold, hard edge of a metal bolt head, rusted but still there. It wasn't bolted to the floor, it was bolted to the wall behind it, but the wall behind it was the one she had been working on, the one with the weakness. A new energy surged through her. This was the balance point. She returned to her crack in the wall, no longer digging at the mortar, but at the space around the bolt. If she could free the shelf from its anchor, she could use it as a lever. It was the work of 2 more days, a frantic, desperate effort, her fingers raw, her body fueled by the last of the bitter roots and the burning image of Gia's triumphant smile. Finally, with a groan of tortured metal, the bolt pulled free from the crumbling mortar. The shelf shifted, leaning forward with a terrifying creak. It was no longer an immovable object. It was a tool. She wedged the broken shard of pottery and a stack of bamboo scrolls under its base, creating a fulcrum. Then, using all the strength she had left, she began to climb the shelves on the opposite wall, her body a fragile counterweight. She reached the top, took a deep breath, and threw herself off, aiming for the top of the loosened shelf. Her weight, slight as it was, hit the great wooden structure with a jarring impact. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with the slow, inexorable protest of ancient wood, the massive shelf began to tip. It moved like a dying giant, its descent measured and grinding, the scrolls tumbling from its shelves like an avalanche of forgotten words. Its top corner, the part she had aimed for, slammed down onto the wedge-shaped keystone in the floor. There was a deep, resonant click, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. The floor vibrated. Lynn scrambled back, her heart in her throat, and watched as a section of the massive foundation stone slid silently sideways, revealing a dark, hollow cavity within. It was real. She crawled forward, her hands shaking, and reached into the darkness. Her fingers brushed against a silk-wrapped bundle. She pulled it out. It was heavy, far heavier than it looked. She unwrapped the silk, her breath catching in her chest. Lying in her palm was the dragon seal of mandate. It was carved from a single piece of flawless white jade, cool and smooth to the touch, the imperial dragon coiled around its base, its eyes seeming to glitter even in the profound darkness. This was the emperor's authority. This was the voice of the heavens, the instrument that turned a man's word into law. This was the power that had condemned her to this tomb. And now it was hers. She stared at it for a long time, the weight of it in her hand a physical manifestation of her own impossible survival. They had buried her with their greatest secret. They had made their deepest strength her key. The irony was so profound, it was almost a physical blow. She did not laugh, she did not cry. She simply closed her fingers around the cool jade, slipped a cord of silk from her own tattered robe through its top, and hung it around her neck. It rested against her sternum, a cold, heavy promise. Now there was only one thing left to do. She turned her attention back to the wall, to the crack that had been her obsession for weeks. It was not enough to have the seal. She had to walk out of this place. She had to show them what a dead woman could do. The storm still raged outside, a symphony of chaos that masked her efforts. She used the end of a heavy scroll shelf plank as a battering ram, striking the weakened point in the wall again and again. She was no longer a mouse scratching at the stone. She was a force of nature in her own right, her every blow fueled by injustice and the cold, hard weight of the jade against her chest. The mortar cracked, the stones shifted, groaning in protest. A sliver of gray light, the first she had seen in months, sliced through the darkness. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She worked with a feverish intensity, pulling at the loosened stones with her bare hands, ignoring the pain as they scraped her skin raw. The opening grew. First a crack, then a hole, then a space large enough for a person to crawl through. The wind tore at her, a blast of ice and snow that felt like a slap and a baptism all at once. She did not hesitate. She crawled through the opening, emerging from the darkness of the archive into the gray, swirling chaos of the blizzard. She stood up. The wind whipped her ragged clothes and tangled hair, and the snow stung her face. But she did not flinch. She felt the cold, but it no longer seemed to be a part of her. She had lived with the cold, she had eaten it, she had made it her ally. This was nothing. Before her was the empty expanse of the northern courtyard, a sea of white, and standing not 20 feet away, frozen in place, was the guard. Wei stared at her, his mouth agape, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He saw not a consort, not a ghost, but something elemental, a creature born of stone and winter, her eyes burning with a light that had no place in this world of snow and shadow. He saw the rags she wore, the gauntness of her face, the blood on her hands, and he saw the heavy, unmistakable shape of the dragon seal resting against her chest. He did not raise his sword. He did not call out. He simply stood there, a statue of disbelief, as the woman who was meant to be dead took her first step back into the world of the living. She did not run. She did not look back at the hole in the wall from which she had been reborn. She simply began to walk, her steps slow but steady, directly toward the distant glowing heart of the imperial palace. She walked out of her tomb. News of her arrival moved faster than the storm. It was a whisper at first, a disbelieving murmur among the kitchen staff who saw a ragged figure cross the service courtyard, then a panicked cry from a sentry at the gate of celestial harmony, and finally a tidal wave of shock that washed through the corridors of the forbidden city. By the time she reached the great dragon's stairway, the one reserved for the emperor alone, a crowd had gathered. Courtiers in their fine silks, ministers with their carefully composed faces, eunuchs and ladies-in-waiting, they all spilled out into the courtyard, their expressions a mixture of fear, awe, and confusion. They parted before her as if she were a spirit, the silence broken only by the howling of the wind and the soft crunch of her bare feet on the snow-dusted marble. They saw a specter, a woman who had been erased from the records, her name stricken from the rolls of the living. But they also saw the thing around her neck. It shone with a soft internal luminescence against the gray light of the storm, a beacon of impossible truth. The dragon seal. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move to stop her. How could they? To lay a hand on her would be to lay a hand on the mandate itself. She was no longer Lin, the disgraced consort. She was an omen, a judgment. Then, a sharp, furious voice cut through the silence. "Seize her!" Empress Jia appeared at the top of the stairs, her face a mask of rage, her perfect composure finally shattered. Two of her personal guards, loyal to her and not the throne, drew their swords and took a hesitant step forward. They looked at Jia, then at the woman below, and then at the seal. They faltered. "She is a ghost, an impostor. It is a trick," Jia shrieked, her voice thin and shrill against the wind. "That seal is a fake. I command you to take it from her." Lynn stopped at the bottom of the stairs. She raised her head and looked at Gia for the first time. Her face was serene, devoid of hatred or triumph. She looked tired, ancient, as if she had lived 1,000 years in the darkness. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her presence was answer enough. She simply raised one hand and rested her fingers lightly on the cool jade of the seal. The gesture was simple, quiet, and absolute. It was a claim. The emperor arrived then, flanked by his own imperial guard, the dragon guard in their black and gold armor. He pushed through the crowd of onlookers, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He saw Gia, her face contorted with fury. He saw the assembled court, their faces pale with shock. And then he saw Lynn. He saw the woman he had condemned, the woman he had walled up in the dark, standing in the heart of his palace, alive. His gaze fell to her chest, and all the color drained from his face. He recognized the specific weight of it, the way the light caught the deep carvings, the precise length of the cord. It was his. It was the seal. He saw the hole in the wall of his own making, the flaw in his perfect, cruel plan. He had thought the archive a tomb, the safest vault in the world. He had used her death as a lock, but the lock had not held. The dead had walked out, and she had taken his authority with her. He looked at Lynn, at her calm, unreadable eyes, and he understood. He had tried to bury his past, to seal away his mistakes, but the past did not die. It waited. And now it stood before him, wearing his power around its neck. He raised a hand, and his own guard lowered their weapons. "Stand down," he commanded, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at Gia, then back at Lynn, and the entire court watched as their emperor, the Son of Heaven, slowly, deliberately bowed his head. It was not a bow of greeting. It was a bow of submission. Months later, the snow had melted and the plum blossoms had come and gone, their fleeting beauty a balm on the memory of the harsh winter. The Northern Archive was no longer a sealed tomb. Its doors stood open to the sunlight, and scholars moved carefully among its shelves, their soft footsteps replacing the long silence. The hole in the wall had been repaired, but not hidden. It was left as a scar, a reminder. Lynn was there, not as a prisoner, but as its master. She had been offered everything: the title of empress, the execution of her enemies, wealth beyond measure. She had refused it all. "I have no interest in a cage, no matter how gilded," she had told the emperor, her voice quiet but unyielding. Instead, she had asked for one thing: the title of imperial archivist, and absolute authority over the histories of the empire. He had granted it without hesitation. It was a position no one had ever wanted, a dusty, thankless job, but in her hands it became a different kind of power. She was the keeper of the truth, the guardian of memory. Kings and ministers now came to her not for favor, but for knowledge. They spoke to her with a deference that bordered on fear, for she knew the secrets they had tried to bury, the bargains they had made, the truths they had tried to erase. She held the seal not as a weapon, but as a key, a symbol of the truth that could not be walled up and forgotten. Wei, the guard who had listened for her death, now stood vigil outside her door. He was her personal guard, a position he had requested himself. He never spoke of what he had seen that day in the snow, but his loyalty was a silent, unwavering presence. He had been assigned to watch a tomb, and in a way he still was. But now he guarded the woman who had walked out of it, the woman who had taught him that some things cannot be buried. Lynn spent her days among the scrolls, her hands no longer bloody, now stained with the ink of her work. She was restoring the histories that had been neglected, adding the stories that had been silenced. Sometimes, in the quiet of the afternoon, she would pause and touch the dragon seal, which she now kept in a simple wooden box on her desk. It was no longer cold. Warmed by the sun that streamed through the open doors, it felt almost like a living thing, its weight a comforting, constant reminder not of the power she had taken, but of the strength she had found. They had tried to make her a footnote in someone else's story, a ghost in a forgotten room. Instead, she had become the author of her own. She had walked out of the darkness and into the light, not to reclaim a throne, but to reclaim herself. And in doing so, she had remade the world. There is a strength in us that we often do not recognize until we are tested. We are pushed, We are challenged, sometimes we are even buried by the circumstances of our lives or the actions of others. We are made to feel forgotten, silenced, erased. And in those moments, in that darkness, it can feel like the end. But what if it isn't? What if, like Lynn, you find that the walls of your prison are not as strong as your will to survive? What if you discover that the very thing meant to entomb you is the key to your liberation? Her story is a reminder that true power isn't about the crowns we wear or the titles we are given. It is about the quiet, unyielding resilience within us. It is the refusal to be erased. It is the strength to stand up after you have been knocked down, to walk out of the darkness, and to wear your survival not as a scar, but as a seal of your own incredible worth. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, we hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of quiet strength and earned redemption. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What was the moment you realized you were stronger than you thought? Until next time, be well. And remember the strength that lies within your own story.